Alicia and I are very, very pleased to be here this morning. We've actually never been on a podium and speaking together, so this is a very exciting moment. And thank you, Sally, so many friends in the audience. Good morning to all of you. And we are a joint center of the business school and the law school. We've been around for about 5 years, and we're really focused on this intersection between policy and finance. And we're organized in a set of projects. There are 8 of them that focus in various areas of clean energy. So with that, I think I've filled up the time while he's putting this up. Good. All right. So this really echoes what Ray was talking about, but in a very simplified form. We think about a sustainable energy future as a triangle of technology, policy, and finance. We've got to be firing on all cylinders at all 3 points of that triangle, and we've got to be integrating across them. And we're very much focused on this policy and finance intersection. When it comes to technology, we're focused on the whole pipeline, from what it takes to move things in basic and applied R&D, through demonstration, through piloting, on to commercialization, and to massive deployment of the sort that Ray was talking about. So for purposes of the next few minutes, innovation and commercialization are the 2 pieces of this pipeline that we're going to focus on. And there's a lot in this pipeline, more than 10,000 companies. This is a big, big pipeline spread across the world in a whole host of relevant areas. So it's an exciting moment. It's a complicated moment. Most of these companies will not get over the finish line, but the ones that do can have very high impact. Policy, the next point of the triangle, it does matter. When the production tax credit is in effect, wind gets deployed in the United States. When it expires, it doesn't. 2012, 7,000 megawatts of wind. The tax credit expired. We only built 1,000 megawatts of wind. The production tax credit today has expired. It does not exist. The investment tax credit for solar runs out at the end of next year, drops from 30 to 10 for commercial and 30 to 0 for residential. So we're relying on some very dicey policy tools. And then finally, finance. We need a lot of money across a very, very complicated spectrum that often extends over decades. Government money in early, key, small amounts of venture money from there. This commercialization process happens. And then ultimately, we get to large-scale deployment of the sort Ray was talking about, where it's a mixture of equity and debt. There are 2 big challenges as we move out of the labs and get to full-scale deployment. We call these the valley of death. One is taking that idea out of the lab and getting it to a point where you can show that it works at small scale. The next challenge is taking that small scale and scaling it up to full-size deployment. So these are the 2 challenges we have. One we call the innovation valley of death. The other we call the commercialization valley of death. This is the big one, the big commercialization one, where venture firms put in small amounts of high-risk capital to get something to the point where it can be commercialized. The other end of the spectrum are the project finance folks like Ray, who put large amounts of low-risk capital into these kinds of projects. Quick example, fracking, 65 years to cross the valley of death. A whole host of technologies that had to converge. Horizontal drilling, hydraulic fracturing, seismology. Some of that work done by the private sector, some by government. And then it happened to, these converged at a moment when natural gas prices got to a high point back in 06 and 07. So technology intersected with the market, and fracking took off. Solar. We talk a lot about solar, but this was Bell Labs' advertisement back in 1954, advertising the solar cell and what we could do with it. Talk about a long, expensive slog. So it doesn't matter what the technology is. This is an expensive, time-consuming. This is not the next app. Let me say that. And with that, let me ask Alicia to carry on, then I'll be back up to give you a couple of quick examples.
Great. Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Sally, and the GSEP team for inviting us to talk about our work here with you today. So, GCEP focuses on hard tech innovation, and as Dan articulated, it's a joint program of 2 professional schools. We're focused on soft tech innovation, so how to get people to think and behave differently. So I'm going to talk a bit about some work we've been leading on how to catalyze private sector investment in clean energy innovation and deployment. This picture here represents one of the challenges we're looking at, which is to say that according to the International Energy Agency, in order to avoid the most catastrophic effects of climate change, we need to scale global investment in clean energy to $1 trillion a year by 2030. And that's $500 million by 2020. And Ray put up some other numbers, but this gives you a yardstick here. We're less than a third of the way there. So we need to figure out how we come up with catalytic activities that can get us to that scale of investment. Let's see. That looks promising. Okay, so I'm going to walk us through kind of the current landscape for innovation and commercialization funding, some new catalysts that we see, and then the work that we're doing at the center to introduce new ideas and innovations into this landscape. So current sources of innovation funding, the government spend about $5 billion, US government spends about $5 billion a year on energy R&D. Many feel arguably that is not nearly enough to achieve our goals, but compared to healthcare, which is about $35 billion, and defense about $75 billion, you can see these are smaller numbers. That's a combination of direct funding into national labs, the ARPA-E budget. You've got academic sources of funding. GCEP is a very good example of how you're seeing university labs develop energy R&D, and you've also got private sources of capital, so corporates, and then risk capital, but keep in mind that that's actually a very small portion of the pie. So Cleantech VC invested less than $200 million in early stage ventures in 2014. That's less than the ARPA-E budget. So what are some of the new sources that are new catalysts that are coming to help bring these innovations really to market? You've got a combination of academic, government, and private sector solutions in terms of accelerators and labs. You've got here at Stanford the Tomcat Center that's trying to help with tech transfer from innovations coming out of Stanford into the commercial marketplace. You've got a whole suite of intermediaries that are helping mostly on the philanthropic side, but starting to bridge into the sort of impact investing and finance first community to help connect philanthropic and impact investors with energy innovation. On the commercialization side, traditional sources, Ray walked through a lot of this, touch on government here too, but the government's role in commercialization is really to de-risk these opportunities. So you see things like the Loan Program Office, which has a significant amount of capital, $30 billion committed, another $40 billion in remaining authority. You've got overseas development finance institutions that are also playing an important role in this conversation. And then institutional investors who are looking for commercial market opportunities, and they're looking for market rate of returns. Some of the new catalysts that are starting to play in the commercialization space, you're seeing a whole suite of announcements from the big banks committing large pools of capital to scaling up investment in clean energy. But keep in mind, this is still largely project finance. This isn't sort of new, first of its kind demonstration plants, because they aren't designed to take on that sort of risk. You've seen some innovation coming out of OPIC with an aligned capital pilot program to help private investors connect with their pipeline of deals. NYSERDA has been doing a lot of really interesting work innovating public-private finance partnerships. You've seen new instruments. We've talked about this. Ray's already covered this stuff, but you're seeing the introduction of new instruments, green bonds, yield cos, and then some, again, new nonprofit and academic sources, which you hadn't seen traditionally, to try and help unlock capital for commercialization. So what are we doing at Stanford? We take a look at this landscape and think about what are some new sources of capital and some new vehicles that could bring solutions to bear on this challenge. So the work that I'm leading is on how to align philanthropic and long-term sources of capital with these critical gaps in both the innovation and commercialization of investment in clean energy. We write papers, we convene meetings, and we build connective tissue to address these challenges. So this is actually a fun timeline to build. This has been a little more than 2 years. It started as a conversation with 25 limited partner investors at the Stanford Management Company to discuss the opportunities and barriers for investment in clean energy. That led to funding from Bloomberg Philanthropies, bringing together partners from the private sector, government, and academia, reached across the street and started to collaborate with the Global Project Center, which is out of the School of Engineering under the leadership of Ashby Monk. And one of the first things we did was launch a investor workshop series called Investing in a New Climate that brings together asset owners to help them better understand the climate exposure in their portfolio. So moving beyond the simple narratives of divestment and ESG screens and into the more complex data sources and tools and strategies for managing climate exposure across a portfolio. This work has led to announcements and meetings at the White House. We've been invited to host an Investing in a New Climate conversation in Paris, and we've seeded a new venture, which I will talk about. So what are these long-term investors? What kind of dollar amounts? Who are they? This is the landscape. We're talking about families, foundations, university endowments, pension funds and insurance companies, and sovereign wealth funds. And in aggregate, we're talking $100 trillion or thereabouts. These are big numbers, but they've been largely limited in terms of having aligned access points to connect to direct investment opportunities in innovation and deployment. And that's the kind of work that we've been leading. So I want to take a minute and talk about this White House Clean Energy Investment Initiative, which we were asked to highlight. This was an exciting announcement building on work that we did at Stanford here on really the bequest of the White House and the Department of Energy. Co-authored a paper on impact investing in the energy sector and the role the federal government can play in catalyzing those sources of capital. That conversation and work led to this announcement that the White House made in February of 2015 with the goal of catalyzing $2 billion in new investment from these long-term investors. They then held a summit in June, this past June, where through really the power of the spotlight that the White House can bring to bear on this conversation, they were able actually to put $4 billion on the board, which can be credited to this initiative. I'll come back to this aligned intermediary concept, but that was those were the points that Stanford, in collaboration with both the Global Project Center and Seiger Taylor Center and a few of our colleagues, were able to put on that board. There was also, in addition to those capital commitments, some announcements from the administration of new executive actions, a Clean Energy Impact Investment Center at the DOE, some new guidance from Treasury on how to account for mission-related investments, and some activities out of the Small Business Administration. So the aligned intermediary, or is what some of my friends and I like to call the billion-dollar paper. This was really born out of a concept paper that I co-authored with Ashby Monk over here at the Global Project Center and a few others in the lead up to the summit to put together this idea for creating a new access point. Oops, jumped ahead. The animation is missing here, but bear with me. So the idea of the aligned intermediary is to create a new access point for the world's largest investors to connect directly with opportunities in clean energy innovation and deployment. It's effectively an outsourced deal team to identify, screen, and assess these opportunities for these long-term investors. We drafted this concept paper, introduced it to the market for feedback, and through a series of conversations and with the lead up with the summit on the calendar, we were able to secure over $1 billion in commitments from these long-term asset owners. That's UC Regents, New Zealand, Alaska, TIAA-CREF, and a family office, Tamarisk, to commit those dollars to working with this concept if we build it. And so with that, with those asset owners committed to those dollar amounts, we were then able to go to foundations and raise money for working capital to really build this thing. So to take it from a concept, which is where it's appropriate for the center to be developing, out into the real world and build a new entity. So we've done that. This is a picture of it, if my words didn't really describe it clearly enough. So you've got the long-term asset owners on one hand, this aligned intermediary sitting in the middle, connecting those asset owners directly with resource innovation projects and companies. Next week, under the backdrop of the State Department's Climate and Clean Energy Finance Forum, we're going to be announcing the new founding CEO to lead this effort, and I will share it with you all now as a little preview. So we've been able to recruit Peter Davidson, who used to be the head of the Loan Program Office at the Department of Energy, to run this effort. And we're very excited about where this will go, but as you'll see, there are a lot of questions yet to be answered. So we've got a good 10-month runway here to figure out the answers to those questions, and hopefully around this time next year, this entity will be operating in the real world. Thank you.
All right, that's the good news stuff that we've been working on with others. We're also interested in teaching old dogs new tricks, basically looking at current financing vehicles and asking ourselves, could they be repurposed? So master limited partnerships, virtually all of the oil and gas pipelines in the United States have been financed using MLPs. Real estate investment trusts increasingly being used to finance big electricity transmission systems. And private activity bonds being used traditionally to finance pollution upgrades to large power plants all over the United States. And we asked ourselves, any way that we might use these in this quest we've got to lower the cost of capital for clean energy. So one of the areas we looked at is tax credits. Tax credits, as Ray said, have been a great vehicle over the last decade, but they are a high-cost, rather inefficient way to be financing renewables. You've got to have taxable profits in your company, or you've got to go into this world of what's called tax equity. There are several other issues, but let me highlight two. Tax equity is scarce, it's expensive, and it's cyclical. Believe it or not, in 2007, before the financial crisis, there were only about 20 tax equity investors in the entire United States. After the crisis, that dropped to about 10. So all of the tax equity that's backing these kinds of projects has come from about 10 investors. That kind of scarcity of capital with the inefficiency of the tax credit world tends to do what? It drives up the cost of capital. Add to that what we already talked about, which is the on and off again nature of the production tax credit and the investment tax credit, and you've got a recipe for real inefficiency. Can't rely on Congress for these financing tools, and we've got a relatively expensive source of capital to back these kinds of projects. We've looked at two solutions, and they're both underway in Washington right now. One are master limited partnerships. It's a curious fact, but when this law was passed by Congress in the early 1980s, it specifically excluded renewables. And we asked ourselves, why should that be? Same issue when you look at real estate investment trusts. Renewables are not included in this financing vehicles. But they're highly attractive, both of them. The market cap, the amount invested to date is huge. You know, $500 billion in the MLP area, $750 billion almost in REITs. Single-digit dividends that they're paying as opposed to tax equity, which tends to cost you in the low double digits, sometimes in the middle double digits. You know, single layer of taxation, structured typically as partnerships, and they're publicly traded like stocks. I can go out and make a $5,000 investment, buy what amounts to a stock, and an oil and gas pipeline. I can't do that when it comes to a wind or a solar project at this point in most circumstances. So I can't buy that kind of stock in a project that I could in an oil and gas pipeline. So we and others went to Washington. We published a major op-ed in the New York Times that helped kick off this conversation, and we and others were able to get a bill introduced, a bipartisan bill introduced in both the House and Senate that would open up MLPs. That was 2012. 2013, that was expanded to a whole host of other things: biofuels, efficiency, cogeneration, carbon capture and sequestration, electricity storage. And that bill got reintroduced in 2015. It could be adopted today by the Congress of the United States. There's good bipartisan support in both the House and the Senate if we only had a vehicle to attach it to. It's not going to be voted on by itself. So that's in good shape right now. Even easier when it comes to REITs, real estate investment trusts. We do not need the Congress of the United States to act. The Internal Revenue Service, in a revenue ruling, could in fact add renewables and other kinds of clean energy to the list of things that qualify for investments in a real estate investment trust. We've said you can finance a cell tower with a REIT. Cell tower is not that different from a wind turbine. Just add a few blades and you got a wind turbine. There shouldn't be that inconsistency. We and others have filed very detailed comments with the IRS on a proposal that the IRS did make to expand REITs to include some of these clean energy sources. So it is moving, not quickly enough, but we're hopeful that before President Obama leaves office, he will issue, his Treasury Secretary will issue this ruling that would open up REITs. And then finally, carbon capture and sequestration. As we've looked at it, and many people around this university, including Sally, have looked at it, it's very clear it's got to be a piece of the response to climate change. It's got to be one of those wedges. And there's some decent to good progress to report, but we've still got some challenges. The progress, we do have a project operating now at a coal-fired power plant in Saskatchewan for the past year that's showing pretty good record of pulling that carbon dioxide out of the emissions from that plant. NRG, you heard about Energy a few minutes ago, is building a CCS project for coal at an existing plant in Texas. ADM, the ethanol company, now is pulling CO2 off of a large ethanol project in Illinois. There are now fertilizer plants that are doing carbon capture, oil refineries. So there's a host of projects, not a huge number, but a decent number, and there's a bunch of big companies that are involved in this business. And the biggest news, perhaps, in the last year is that a major utility is working on a project at a natural gas-fired power plant, a new natural gas-fired power plant, to capture CO2. So it's coal, it's natural gas power, and it's a whole host of industrial sources that we've really got to get after. But the costs are too high. The classic problem with any new energy technology, the costs are too high. And this is what the president of the project in Canada had to say. You know, it's expensive, and he's hopeful that the next plant is going to be cheaper. That's always the hope, but we've got to do some things to speed this up. So we began to ask ourselves, what could we do? And in this conversation here at Stanford, someone said, you know, there is this old financing technique that was used to clean up power plants back in the 70s and 80s. That is to say, to install electrostatic precipitators, flue gas desulfurization, all those things we put on power plants to clean up LA, which is on the left and the right in this picture, and to clean up lots of other cities across the United States. And it turns out what was used to the tune of $100 billion in today's dollars are something called private activity bonds, a form of municipal bond financing. But the difference is you can use them with respect to private facilities if those private facilities are serving a public purpose. And in this case, it would be cleaning up the air emissions from a private power plant using a private activity bond. And that's how they got used in lots of cities around the United States, for example, for cutting SO2 emissions from power plants. But the authority for private activity bonds was eliminated in the big 1986 Tax Act. Gone for using private activity bonds to capture air pollution from power plants. Oops. Ooh, now what did I do? This was the good part. All right. There we go. I did it. I am not tech savvy, but I did it myself. But here's the curious part of this story. As we looked around and said, well, that's an interesting idea, we discovered that NRG had used private activity bonds in part to finance its carbon capture plant in Texas. And we said, what the heck is that about? How is it that this law that fell off the books in 1986 is still being used at a coal-fired power plant in Texas? It turns out if you're in a hurricane zone, or some kind of federally declared disaster zone, you get access to these financing tools that you don't normally get access to. NRG happened to be inside the Hurricane Ike zone. Another carbon capture plant in Texas was outside it and didn't qualify. They've been struggling to finance their plant ever since and have gone to China. It's really been very difficult. We said this is not a good way to make public policy, depending upon a disaster, to present a financing option. So we said, well, maybe there's a chance of getting something going on this. And sure enough, NRG said, well, we liked what we did at our plant. We'd love to use it elsewhere. So they joined an effort to convince Congress to change the tax code, which is a very simple change. You add a few words back to the tax code that says you can use private activity bonds in the case of carbon capture and sequestration. And I'm hopeful, fingers crossed, that in the next couple of weeks, this bill will be introduced in the Senate with good, strong, bipartisan support, including 2 members, one a Republican, one a Democrat, of the Senate Finance Committee. So that's another example of how you can repurpose an old tool. And with that, we would be happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Really exciting. Alicia and Dan, thanks for sharing this great work. My question is for Alicia on this new organization that's being set up. Will the investments be totally return-driven or totally return-driven? And also prevent significant amounts of greenhouse gases. So there's a emission screen absolutely on the opportunities. And one of the big questions that we'll be wrestling with is what's the corporate form of this new organization? But it will be mission-oriented, whether it's a nonprofit or some sort of hybrid structure. But yes, it will be both commercial returns and impact.
So, Alicia, could that fund be used for batteries that are near the end of their development cycle? Good.
It could.
And Dan, instead of just adding that for carbon sequestration, how about using that for the rollout for renewable energy and storage?
Great question. As I said, there are a variety of mechanisms, and I mentioned both master limited partnerships and real estate investment trusts that would be useful tools for renewables. And as I showed, those have expanded to include other types of projects. So I think the key right now is CCS really needs some help, but there's no reason that others might suggest that you expand this PAB legislation. One thing I do want to say about the aligned intermediary, it's an amazingly exciting development, but at this point, it is not an investment tool. It is not an investment vehicle. It's not going to have its own capital, and you should probably explain that a bit.
Yeah, so we're trying to actually capture a couple birds with one stone with the aligned intermediary, and in addition to solving the climate crisis, we're also trying to solve the financial services industry's bloat. So the idea, at least at the onset, is not to have a committed pool of capital that's earning, 2% management fees. That may change, but at least at the onset, the idea here is a service, sort of an impact investment bank, buy-side impact investment bank service.
Putting those who need the money together with those who have the money.
So over here, question for Dan on the gap of death. How much of that do you think is related to the, let's say, the quality of the business cases on the other side? And I'll give a couple of specific examples. Things that, some of the classical smart grid benefits are things like enhanced asset utilization, overall efficiency of the grid, improvement of the efficiency of the grid, higher penetrations of renewables. And these are things where nobody really makes money if they happen. And I wonder how important that is in the whole scheme of the gap of death and financing.
I think it's critical, and the fracking, I think, is a good example. We could have had, in fact, we did have, in many respects, the intersection of all those different technologies. But had natural gas prices remained low instead of that big run-up, it would have been delayed. You needed that stimulus from the market. You needed higher prices into which this technology could go. So, and by the same token, it's taken some dramatic changes with respect to solar. The biggest influence, I think, was the decision, the demand from Germany and the response from China. You know, the big German demand and the big response from China, helping to drive down prices for solar, and then backed up by these various incentives that have been provided in various countries around the world. We wouldn't be very far along with solar, or not nearly as far as we've come, if those sorts of developments hadn't happened. So bottom line, you got to be able to make money, or it's not going to happen.
I'm going to take advantage of having all this expertise up there. Dan, you did a great job of presenting the MLP and some of the other structures. I didn't see YieldCo up there, and NRG's been big on, I think they did the very first YieldCo.
Great question. A YieldCo is essentially a synthetic MLP. That's the way it's been described by several folks. And it'd be interesting to get Ray to answer this, but I would suggest that YieldCos would not have developed had this MLP legislation been adopted in 2012. It was the lack of access to the real MLPs that I think caused the creative development of these synthetic MLPs called YieldCos. MLPs have some advantage over a YieldCo, particularly on the tax side. So, quick story, at our big renewable energy finance conference that we do every year in New York, the question was put to the audience: if you had your choice, would you pick MLPs or would you pick YieldCos? And by a decent majority, folks said we'd prefer MLPs, and largely because it's a $500 billion industry. We know how to do it. We're not having to invent something. And I think to some extent, this serious drop we've had in YieldCos reflects some of the aspects of YieldCos which makes them slightly less advantageous than MLPs.